It was supposed to be nothing more than another quiet night on the edge of town. The kind of night where the roads were empty, and the only light came from a lonely neon sign buzzing faintly above a roadside diner. Inside, a young waitress named Rachel wiped down the counters, humming softly to herself, thinking about getting home to her little boy who was already fast asleep. For her, this diner was more than just a job. It was survival, a way to pay the bills and hold her life together. But in a matter of moments, the stillness of that night would be shattered. Because when the front door swung open, 3 men walked in, their boots heavy on the tiled floor, their laughter too loud for a place so small. She looked up, and though she forced a smile, her hands trembled just slightly. The men weren't there for food, not really. They were there for attention, for control, for something that Rachel did not want to give. They made crude remarks as they leaned over the counter, knocking over salt shakers, mocking her when she tried to brush them off politely. Each second that passed felt heavier, as though the walls of that little diner were closing in around her. And the other customers, the handful of truckers and night shift workers, sat frozen in their booths, unsure of what to do, afraid of what might happen if they stood up. Rachel's heart raced, but she couldn't show fear. Fear, she knew, only gave them more power. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself, but the night was only just beginning, and danger had only just stepped inside. What she did not yet realize was that her life was about to collide with another group of strangers, men who lived by their own code, men who had walked paths filled with violence and loyalty, brotherhood and reputation, and on this night, their paths would lead them through that very same diner door. The question is, why did these thugs target Rachel in the first place? Who exactly were they, and what did they want from a single mother working late? And what role did the bikers, men feared and respected in equal measure, play in what happened next? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is far from simple, and just when it seemed Rachel had no way out, the door swung open once again. Rachel was 28 years old, a single mother raising her son in a small apartment just outside of town. Life had not given her many breaks, and each day was a balancing act between exhaustion and determination. She worked double shifts whenever she could, saving every dollar in the hope that one day her boy might have a life different from hers. The diner wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and in its neon glow, Rachel found a kind of stability she had never known. The regulars knew her by name, and though her smile was often tired, it was genuine, born out of quiet resilience. She had dreams once, dreams of school, of travel, of a different kind of future. But over time she had learned to trade them for something simpler, safety, shelter, and the hope that her child would never feel the same weight she carried on her shoulders. The diner itself was more than just a workplace. For the truckers who passed through, it was a warm cup of coffee on cold nights. For locals, it was a place to share stories, to sit in comfort when the world outside felt too harsh. And for the bikers who occasionally rolled through town, it was neutral ground, a place where engines cooled and tension stayed outside the doors. In a town where lines between good and bad were blurred, the diner was a fragile sanctuary, one that held people together, if only for a little while. But even sanctuaries can be broken, and on that night, Rachel would learn just how quickly safety could unravel. Because in a world where some came to rest, others came to take. And the men who stepped in that night were not there seeking comfort. They were there to disrupt it. The 3 thugs who entered had been seen before around town, drifting in and out of bars, always causing small trouble that never seemed to catch up with them. Nobody knew their real stories, but everyone knew their kind: loud, reckless, and searching for weakness. They carried themselves with a swagger that suggested they had little to lose, and perhaps that made them more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. Rachel had seen men like them before, and she understood the silent rule: stay polite, stay small, and maybe they would leave without causing too much harm. But this night was different. This night the stakes would rise higher than she could have ever imagined. What Rachel didn't yet know was that her life was about to collide with another group entirely. The bikers who roared down the highways were men wrapped in stories, whispered about in town with equal parts fear and admiration. To some, they were saviors who protected their own. To others, they were outlaws who brought nothing but chaos. But whatever their reputation, one truth remained. They lived by a code outsiders rarely understood. And as Rachel stood inside that diner, fighting to keep her composure, she had no way of knowing that by the time the night was over, those men would change her life forever. Rachel had no idea that night would draw two worlds together, and she would be at the very center of it all. The night had been moving slowly before the men walked in, but once they entered, time itself seemed to shift. Rachel could feel it in the way the room fell quiet, in the way conversations cut off mid-sentence and coffee cups were set down with careful silence. The men spread themselves out at the counter loud and careless, tossing words at her that weren't meant to be kind. She forced a professional smile, the kind she had worn 1,000 times before, but inside her chest, her heart beat faster. One comment turned into another, and soon their laughter grew sharper, edged with a threat that every ear in the diner could hear. Rachel took their order, hoping that keeping busy would end it, but these men weren't here for food. They were here for her. It started small. Remarks about her appearance, mocking the way she moved behind the counter, testing her patience with every word. Then one of them leaned too close, knocking a coffee cup from her hand, letting it shatter on the floor. The sound echoed through the diner, and Rachel bent down to clean the mess, her hands shaking though she tried to hide it. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the way their presence filled every corner of the room. A trucker shifted in his seat, looking as though he might intervene, but then he froze, his courage faltering as one of the men turned and glared, daring anyone to interfere. The air inside that small space grew tighter, heavier, and Rachel knew she was running out of ways to keep the situation under control. The clock above the door ticked loudly, each second stretching into something unbearable. One of the thugs reached across the counter and tugged at Rachel's apron, pulling her just slightly closer, testing how far they could push. She pulled back, firm but calm, her voice steady though inside she was unraveling. Around her, the diner felt paralyzed, every person watching but no one willing to rise. Fear is contagious, and in that moment, it had spread through the room like fire. Rachel's breath quickened, and for the first time she wondered if this was the night something irreversible would happen. She braced herself, searching for a way out that didn't exist, and then, just as the violence reached its breaking point, the sound of engines filled the air. The sound came first, low and steady, like distant thunder rolling across the highway. Heads turned toward the windows as a row of headlights cut through the rain-slicked night. The thugs paused mid-laugh, their voices faltering as the unmistakable roar of motorcycles grew louder, filling the silence with power that could not be ignored. Rachel felt the vibration under her feet as the engines drew closer, the noise wrapping around the diner until it seemed the walls themselves might shake. And then, in a sudden burst, the door swung open and a line of men stepped inside, their leather jackets glistening with raindrops, their presence undeniable. The entire room shifted at once. What had moments earlier been a small, trapped space filled with fear was suddenly brimming with something new. Uncertainty. The bikers didn't rush or shout. They walked with deliberate steps, their boots heavy against the floor, their eyes locked on the scene before them. Rachel stood frozen behind the counter, the thugs now caught in a moment of hesitation. For the first time that night, their arrogance wavered. They exchanged glances, their laughter gone, their voices silenced by the sheer weight of the newcomer's presence. No one in the diner moved, no one spoke, as if waiting for the balance to tip one way or another. It was as though the world itself had narrowed into that single room, holding its breath to see what came next. The bikers stopped just feet away from the counter, forming a line that separated Rachel from the men who had been tormenting her. Their leader, taller than the rest, took a step forward and stood firmly, saying nothing, but speaking volumes in the way his stance carried authority. The thugs shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado thinning as they realized the situation had changed. Still, no one knew which way it would turn. Would these men bring order or unleash chaos? Would this diner become a battlefield, or would Rachel finally be safe? The air was electric, tension stretched thin across every second, and in that moment, one thought echoed in the minds of everyone inside. No one knew if this was about to turn into a war zone or a rescue. But what happened next shocked everyone in the diner, including Rachel herself. For a long moment, the diner stood still, caught between silence and eruption. The thugs, who only minutes earlier had filled the room with mocking laughter, now found themselves staring at men who did not flinch, men whose very presence spoke louder than words. One of them muttered something under his breath, his voice cracking with a false confidence he could no longer hold. Another tried to smile, pretending he wasn't rattled. But the leader of the trio knew better. He tugged at his jacket, signaling to the others, and with a last bitter glare toward Rachel, he pulled them toward the door. "This isn't over," he growled, his words cutting through the air like a promise of trouble yet to come. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving behind the echo of threats that hung heavy in the silence. Rachel stood rooted, her chest heaving, the weight of what had just happened settling into her bones. Relief washed through the room in waves, but it was not the kind that erased fear. It was the fragile kind that comes only when danger has passed, not when it is gone for good. Customers slowly began to move again, some whispering in hushed tones, others shaking their heads as if to convince themselves it had truly ended. Hours later, the police arrived, too late to stop what had happened but ready to take statements. They asked questions, wrote down details, and made promises about patrols and investigations. But Rachel knew better than to put her faith in paperwork. She had seen enough nights like this to understand how easily stories could be forgotten, how quickly fear faded once it no longer belonged to someone else. Still, she answered their questions, her voice steady, her son's face flashing in her mind with every word. The diner community began to rally around her in the days that followed. Truckers who barely knew her left extra tips on the counter. Locals dropped in more often, offering smiles that carried sympathy. Some spoke about the terror they had felt sitting in those booths, frozen while Rachel stood alone. Their words carried guilt as much as gratitude. The story spread quickly, retold in gas stations, whispered about in bars. Everyone wanted to talk about the night the thugs walked in and the bikers followed. But as much as people wanted to call the men who arrived saviors, others weren't so sure. Who were they really? Were they protectors who stepped in when no one else would, or vigilantes who lived by rules outside the law? Their silence that night had been just as powerful as their actions, but silence leaves room for questions, and questions have a way of demanding answers. And soon enough, answers would come. Because the truth about those bikers was not as simple as the town wanted to believe. Their arrival was no coincidence, and their presence inside that diner had roots deeper than anyone could have imagined. Rachel had been pulled into a story that stretched far beyond her late-night shift, a story tied to loyalty, history, and choices that blurred the line between justice and vengeance. And while she tried to return to her routine, wiping down the same counters, filling the same coffee cups, Rachel knew in her heart that the night was far from over. Because soon the truth about those bikers would surface. The town never forgot that night, but what most people didn't realize was that the bikers hadn't just stumbled into the diner by chance. In the weeks leading up to the confrontation, word had quietly spread through back channels about the thugs who were making Rachel's late shifts unbearable. Truckers mentioned it, locals whispered it, and someone carried that word to men who paid attention to such things. The group that walked through the diner door that night had been watching, not for trouble, but for her. Their presence wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and it was meant to send a message. The leader of the group, a man named Darnell, carried his own history with that diner. Years before, his younger sister had worked the very same counter where Rachel now stood. She too had faced nights of crude remarks, of unwanted hands reaching too far across the counter, of fear disguised behind a polite smile. Darnell had never forgotten the helplessness she felt, and when he heard that Rachel was enduring the same torment, He knew he couldn't stand aside. He gathered his brothers, men who had seen their share of violence but understood the meaning of loyalty, and together they walked through that door not for chaos, but for protection. For Rachel, the truth struck deep. Gratitude overwhelmed her as she realized that she had not been alone, not really, not even in her darkest moment. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered her thanks, words too small for the weight of what she felt. Relief poured out of her in waves, relief that someone, anyone, had cared enough to stand between her and danger when no one else had. Sometimes protection comes from the least expected places, and sometimes family is found in the people who walk in when others walk out. Rachel returned to her work in the days that followed, but she was no longer the same. She carried with her the knowledge that even in the loneliest moments, unseen hands might still be reaching to hold her up. In the weeks after the incident, justice finally found its way back to the men who had caused so much fear. One of the thugs was arrested in connection to a separate violent crime, proof that their threats had always been more than just words. The others drifted away, their hold over the town broken by the simple fact that someone had dared to stand against them. For Rachel, the scars of that night remained, but so did the lesson. Courage isn't always loud, and sometimes it rides in quietly, headlights cutting through the rain, boots heavy on a diner floor. And now we leave you with this question. Do you think the bikers did the right thing? Or did they take the law into their own hands? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one.